I used to believe a house was just wood, cement, and paint. Four walls to keep rain out and heat in. A roof to sleep under. Something practical, something ordinary. I was wrong. A house can also be memory. It can be sacrifice. It can be the quiet proof that you survived things no one else saw. And the house I built was all of those things. I still remember the first day I stood on that empty lot. There was nothing there except dry dirt and a crooked fence that leaned like it had already given up. The ground was uneven. The grass had grown wild. If you didn't know better, you'd think the place had been forgotten by the world. But when I looked at that land, I didn't see emptiness. I saw possibility. At that time, my life had already taken more from me than it had given. My wife had been gone for 3 years. Cancer doesn't just take a person, it takes the rhythm of a house. It takes laughter, arguments, the small sounds that make a home feel alive. When she died, the silence became unbearable. Our son had just left for university then. He was chasing the future we had worked so hard to give him. I never told him how empty the house felt after he left. A parent learns to swallow certain kinds of loneliness. That old apartment we used to live in carried too many memories, too many echoes of the life we used to have. So I made a decision. If I was going to live alone, I wanted to build something new, something that wasn't filled with ghosts. That's how the house began. Not as a luxury, not as an investment, but as survival. I spent 2 years building it piece by piece, not because I wanted to, but because that's what my finances allowed. Every paycheck had a destination before it even reached my bank account. Foundation first, then walls, then roofing. Sometimes construction would stop for months while I saved enough money to continue. Friends told me I was stubborn. They said it would be easier to buy something finished. But this wasn't about easy. Every brick meant something. Every window frame carried the weight of overtime shifts, missed vacations, and quiet nights where I counted every dollar before deciding whether I could afford the next step. The first time the front door was installed, I stood there staring at it longer than I care to admit. Because for the first time since my wife died, something in my life felt stable again. Something felt permanent. I told myself that someday, when my son had his own family, this house would be filled with laughter again. That thought carried me through the hardest days. Years passed. The house slowly turned into what I had imagined. A small garden grew in the backyard. I planted the first tree myself. It started as a thin stick in the ground. Now it stands taller than the roof. Time does that. It turns patience into something visible. My son visited during holidays when he could. Every time he came home, the house felt alive again. His voice filled the rooms the way it used to when he was younger. But as the years passed, his visits became shorter. Work, life, relationships. That's what happens when children grow up. And I never blamed him for that. In fact, I was proud of him. He was building his own life. But loneliness has a strange way of creeping into quiet spaces. Sometimes at night, I would walk through the hallway and pause outside the extra bedroom, the one I had built with the future in mind. A room for grandchildren. A room for family. A room that stayed empty for years. Until the day he called me with news that changed everything. I'm getting married. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said it. Kitchen, late afternoon. The sunlight was coming through the window above the sink. For a moment, I didn't say anything. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because happiness sometimes surprises you when you least expect it. He told me about her. How they met. How long they had been together. And finally, he asked the question that mattered most. Would it be okay if we stayed with you for a while after the wedding? I didn't hesitate. Of course they could. That house had been waiting for family for years. I thought the empty rooms were finally about to fulfill their purpose. The first time I met her, she seemed kind, respectful, the type of person who spoke carefully, like she didn't want to offend anyone. She complimented the house almost immediately. "This place is beautiful," she said as she walked through the living room. "It feels warm." That word stayed with me. Warm. Because that's exactly what I had hoped the house would feel like. She asked questions about everything. When the house was built, how long it took, whether I designed parts of it myself. At the time, I interpreted her curiosity as appreciation. Looking back now, I realize curiosity can sometimes mean something else entirely. But in that moment, I was simply happy my son had found someone who seemed to value the same things we did. The wedding came quickly. Small ceremony. Family. Friends. I remember watching my son standing there in his suit, looking both nervous and excited. For a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be. Time does strange things like that. It folds decades into a single moment. After the ceremony, the house finally became what I had dreamed about for so long. Full. Laughter returned to the dining room. 2 voices instead of 1. Footsteps in the hallway. Even the kitchen seemed brighter somehow. At first, everything felt natural. She insisted on helping with dinner. She brought small decorations for the living room. Nothing dramatic, just small touches that made the place feel slightly different. At the time, I appreciated the effort. A home evolves when new people enter it. That's normal. But small changes have a way of revealing bigger intentions over time. The first thing I noticed was furniture moving. One afternoon, I came home from grocery shopping and saw the sofa had been shifted across the room. "It opens up the space more," she explained casually. I nodded. It did look different. Not worse. Just different. Then came the next change. Pictures removed from the hallway. Not thrown away, just placed carefully in a drawer. "Minimalist design," she said with a smile. I told myself it was harmless. Homes change when families grow. Still, something about the pace of those changes felt slightly off. The house had stood the same way for years. Now things were moving every few days. Then conversations began shifting too. Subtle questions. Questions about finances. Questions about ownership. One evening during dinner, she asked something that made me pause. "Have you ever thought about putting the house in your son's name?" The room went quiet for a second. My son looked surprised. I simply shrugged. "Not really," I said. "It's just easier for inheritance later," she continued casually. "Less paperwork." It sounded logical. Practical. But the question lingered in my mind longer than I expected. It wasn't the question itself that bothered me. It was the timing. They had been married less than 2 months. Still, I pushed the thought aside. Family requires trust. And trust means sometimes ignoring doubts. Weeks passed. Then months. Gradually, decisions about the house began happening without me. Curtains replaced. Kitchen shelves reorganized. Storage areas reassigned. None of these things were major on their own. But taken together, they created a quiet shift in the atmosphere. The house still belonged to me. Yet somehow it began to feel like I was slowly becoming a guest inside it. I told myself I was imagining things. Until the evening, everything finally became clear. It was late when I returned home that night. I had stayed longer at work than usual. The streetlights were already on when I parked outside the house. From the outside, everything looked normal. Lights in the windows. Curtains drawn. Home. I walked up to the front door like I had thousands of times before. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my key, and slid it into the lock. But the key didn't turn. At first, I thought I had inserted it incorrectly. I tried again. Same result. Then I looked closer. The lock was different. For a moment, My brain refused to understand what I was seeing. Different color, different shape, different mechanism. Someone had replaced it. My heart began beating faster. I knocked. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened slowly. And there she stood. Calm. Almost relaxed. "Oh," she said, "you're back." I looked past her into the house. Everything inside was exactly where it had always been. Except one thing. The locks. "What happened to the door?" I asked quietly. She leaned against the frame, like this conversation was routine. "We changed them." The words landed harder than I expected. "Why?" She glanced behind her toward the living room. "We thought it would be better this way." Better? That word felt strangely cold. "For who?" I asked. She sighed slightly, like the explanation should have been obvious. "Things are different now," she said. Different. I stood there on the porch of the house I had built with my own hands. The house I had spent years paying for. The house that carried every sacrifice of my adult life. And suddenly, I wasn't allowed inside it. My son appeared behind her then. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, avoiding my eyes. That silence told me everything. "This house should belong to the younger generation," she continued calmly. "It makes more sense." More sense. I could feel anger rising inside me. But anger has never been my first instinct. Years of hardship teach you something important. Reacting quickly rarely solves anything. Instead, I looked at my son. He still couldn't meet my eyes. And that hurt more than the locked door. For a moment, none of us spoke. The night air felt colder than it should have. Finally, I nodded slowly. "All right," I said. Just one word. No argument. No shouting. Her expression shifted slightly, almost surprised by my calm reaction. Maybe she expected resistance. Maybe she expected drama. Instead, I turned around and walked back down the steps. The gravel crunched under my shoes. Behind me, the door closed. The sound echoed louder than it should have. But as I reached my car, something strange happened. The humiliation I expected to feel never fully arrived. Instead, another thought quietly took its place. Because there was something about that house she didn't know. Something neither of them knew. Years ago, after watching relatives fight over property and inheritance, I made a decision. I promised myself that my home would never become a weapon used against me. So I had prepared. Quietly. Legally. Carefully. As I sat in the driver's seat, I took out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts and found a number I hadn't needed in years. My lawyer. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Hello." I looked back at the house through the windshield. Lights glowing in the windows. People inside believing they had already won. Then I spoke calmly. "I think it's time we review those property documents." Because the house I built had one more foundation. One they hadn't discovered yet. And when they did, everything would change. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely looks like betrayal at first. Sometimes it looks like confidence. Sometimes it sounds like victory. And sometimes it walks around your own home, believing it already owns the place. 3 days passed after the night I was locked out of my own house. 3 quiet days. 3 days where I didn't knock on that door again. 3 days where I didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't demand anything back. To them, that silence meant one thing. Surrender. To me, it meant patience. Because there are 2 ways people fight battles. Some people use noise. Others use time. I chose time. The first morning after it happened, I met my lawyer for breakfast. His office was in a small building downtown, but we didn't meet there. Instead, we sat in a quiet cafe where the smell of coffee drifted through the air and people minded their own business. He had been my lawyer for nearly 15 years. Not because I liked legal paperwork, but because life had taught me something important. When people see property, they stop seeing relationships. They start seeing opportunity. I told him everything. The changed locks, the conversation at the door, the words she used. Things are different now. He listened quietly, stirring his coffee slowly. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said calmly, "they've certainly made this easier." I raised an eyebrow. "Easier?" "Yes," he replied. "Illegal occupation cases are much simpler when the other side is arrogant." I almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny, but because his tone carried a calm certainty that reminded me of something important. Preparation beats impulse every time. Years earlier, when I built the house, I had watched something ugly happen inside my extended family. Two cousins had spent nearly 4 years fighting in court over a house their parents left behind. 4 years. Lawyers. Arguments. Broken relationships. All over walls and land. I promised myself I would never leave that kind of chaos behind for my son. So when the house was completed, I asked my lawyer a simple question. How do I make sure this place can't be taken away from me while I'm still alive? The solution he proposed wasn't complicated, but it was precise. Ownership, usage rights, transfer restrictions, legal protections layered together like a lock system no single action could override. At the time it felt excessive. Now it felt wise. Back in the cafe, my lawyer slid a folder across the table toward me. "Everything is still exactly as we arranged it," he said. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of the documents we had signed years ago. The house wasn't just a piece of property. Legally, it was part of a protected arrangement. No transfer. No rental. No sale. No legal occupancy change. Not without my authorization. Not while I was alive. Even utilities and residence registrations were tied to that structure. Changing the door locks meant nothing. Legally speaking, they had accomplished absolutely nothing. Except one thing. They had revealed their intentions. My lawyer tapped the edge of the folder. "They think possession means control," he said. "But legally, possession without authority is just trespassing." I leaned back in my chair. Outside the cafe window, the city moved like it always did. Cars. People. Noise. Life continued. Inside my chest, the anger I expected still hadn't arrived. Instead, there was something else. Clarity. Because the truth is, I wasn't fighting for the house. Not really. I was fighting for something deeper. Respect. We finished breakfast, and he explained the next steps carefully. "We don't rush this," he said. "Why not?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "Because arrogance tends to make people expose themselves if you give them time." So I waited. 3 days. And during those 3 days, something interesting happened inside that house. They began celebrating. Of course, I didn't see it myself. But news travels in quiet neighborhoods. A neighbor mentioned seeing new furniture delivered. Another said they saw lights on late into the night. Someone else mentioned hearing music through the windows. Victory celebrations. Inside a house they believed was now theirs. Confidence is powerful, but misplaced confidence is even more revealing. On the 4th day, the phone call came. It wasn't from my son. It was from her. Her voice sounded different from the last time we spoke. Still confident, but sharper. "Where are you staying?" she asked immediately. "At a friend's place," I replied calmly. "Oh," she said. There was a pause. Then she said something interesting. "We've been looking into the property documents." I stayed silent. She continued. It would be easier if you just transferred ownership to my husband now. Easier. That word again. Why? I asked. Another pause. Well, it avoids complications. Complications. Now I almost smiled. Because complications had already begun. You should talk to a lawyer, I told her calmly. The line went quiet. Then she said something that told me everything I needed to know. We already are. That conversation ended quickly. But it set the next events into motion. 2 days later, my lawyer called. They've contacted a property attorney, he said. And that attorney requested copies of the ownership structure. I waited. Then he laughed softly. I don't think they expected what they found. That's when the reality began unfolding inside that house. Because when their lawyer reviewed the documents, several things became very clear. First, the house legally could not be transferred without my direct authorization. Second, the property structure prohibited unauthorized residency changes. Third, any attempt to register utilities, taxes, or legal occupancy without my approval would automatically trigger legal review. In simple terms, the house did not recognize them. Not legally. Not administratively. Not in any system that mattered. The locks they changed meant nothing. Because the house itself refused to betray its owner. The first sign of trouble appeared when they tried to change the electricity account. The utility company rejected the request. Then came the water services. Rejected again. Then municipal residency registration. Denied. Each system pointed back to the same fact. I was the only recognized authority tied to the property. That's when panic began replacing confidence. My son called me that evening. His voice sounded tired. Dad, we need to talk. I agreed. We met at the same cafe where I had spoken with my lawyer days earlier. When he walked in, he looked older somehow. Stress has a way of aging people quickly. He sat across from me without speaking for a moment. Then he finally said the words I had expected. She didn't know. I looked at him quietly. Did you? He hesitated, then shook his head. Silence filled the space between us. Finally, he asked the question that mattered most. Did you plan this? The question surprised me. Plan what? I asked. This protection. I thought about it for a moment. No, I said. I planned peace. He looked confused. I planned to make sure no one would ever fight over this house after I'm gone. The truth hung in the air between us. Then why didn't you tell us? He asked. Because I never expected to need it while I was still alive. That sentence seemed to hit him harder than anything else. For a long moment, he stared at the table. Then he whispered something that sounded almost like regret. She thought you would just accept it. Accept it. That word carried more weight than he realized. Accept humiliation. Accept displacement. Accept disrespect. And suddenly, something inside me became very clear. This was never about the house. It was about assumption. The assumption that kindness equals weakness. The assumption that patience equals surrender. I opened my briefcase slowly and placed the property documents on the table between us. He looked down at them, then back at me. What happens now? He asked. Now, I said calmly, we correct a misunderstanding. Later that evening, we returned to the house together. The same porch. The same door. The same locks. But this time, the balance of power had shifted. She opened the door when she saw us. Her expression immediately hardened. What is he doing here? She asked. My son stepped aside. I walked forward. Then I placed the documents gently on the small table near the entrance. These, I said quietly, are the legal conditions connected to this house. She didn't move at first. Then she picked them up. As she read, the confidence in her face began slowly fading. Page by page, clause by clause, every assumption collapsing under legal reality. "This can't be right," she said finally. But it was. The house had rules. Rules created long before she ever entered it. Rules designed to protect the years of sacrifice that built it. And rules that no changed lock could erase. She looked up at me, anger mixing with disbelief. "You set a trap." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I set a boundary." The difference between those two things matters more than most people realize. Behind her, my son stood silently, watching, learning. Because sometimes the most powerful lesson a parent can teach isn't spoken. It's demonstrated. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I simply pointed to the truth. "This house," I said calmly, "will always welcome family." Then I paused. But family respects the hands that built it. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Because for the first time since the wedding, the house felt like it belonged to its true purpose again. Not greed, not control, but dignity. And as I stepped inside the home I built, I realized something important. Walls remember the intentions they were built with. And no amount of ambition can rewrite foundations laid with sacrifice. That night, the house did something remarkable. It locked the right person out. Not physically, but morally. And that kind of lock is impossible to break.